all this instability creates cost. The inflation creates a cost because remember, inflation is a tax. Inflation goes up, you get taxed because of it. And then to wring inflation out, the Fed overdoes it, causes a recession, and it slow down in the economy, and that'll slow down the amount of money that you're getting too. And also, you might lose your job.
Embark on a captivating exploration of economics with Professor Steve Henke in this thought-provoking video. Uncover the intricacies of inflation, recession, and population decline, gaining profound insights into fiscal policies.
The labor market's a very lagging indicator. So the labor market is pretty strong right now, but there's some signs creeping into it that indicate that it's softening up a little bit. The number of hours worked per worker per month is starting to go down. In other words, people are contracting the number of hours out there. They're not working as much overtime and things like that. So they start doing that. And it isn't until a recession actually hits and profits really start getting squeezed that you lay off a worker, because workers, you want to keep them. You train them and invest them, invest a lot in human capital, and you don't want to let a worker go. You don't want to fire somebody. You cut back their time they're working, don't give them as much overtime and things like that. But when a recession comes and profits get really squeezed, then you find layoffs and the broader labor market indicators like unemployment, so they start really going south on you. But that doesn't really happen until you get into the bowels of a recession.
And does the Fed really need to tighten any further for inflation to come back down?
As Paul did say one thing that I agree with. He said they're very restrictive now. They're in a restrictive zone, but he's talking about interest rates and real interest rates. If you look at the money supply, which is the key thing they're not looking at, and that is actually contracting at a 4% year over year. If you look at a 3-month annualized rate, it's contracting at 5.1%. If you look at a 6-month, you've got minus 5.5% on an annualized basis. We haven't seen that kind of contraction since 1938. So it's very, very tight right now. And that's why you are seeing inflation coming down. Whether you look at the headline consumer price index, or you look at the producer price index, or whether you look at the core number that just came out, all of these things are coming down. Now, obviously, the producer price index is the most sensitive one. That's coming down faster than the headline CPI, but the headline CPI is coming down, and it's at 4% per annum, which is in the zone. Remember, John Greenwood and I said by the end of the year, we would see inflation come down to between 2 and 5% year over year. Well, it's already at 4%. And I think by the end of the year, we could very well be closer to the 2%, the lower end of our forecast range. And that's because the money supply keeps contracting, and a big contributor to money supply, the biggest one, is commercial bank credit, and that's fallen from double digits, about 10% year over year a year ago. Now it's 1.73%. It's slowing way down, and I think it will get into contraction. Banks are really squeezed and cutting back on credit. And that's very important because deposits at banks make up 82.5% of M2, which is a money supply. So tightness is there. Any way you look at it, if you want to look at Powell's thing with the interest rates, they're tight. And if you want to look at interest rates another way, look at the yield curve. the yield curve is very inverted, indicating extreme tightness, which always precedes, by the way, a recession. So we're getting into now talk about recession. We've talked about inflation. Let's talk about recession. It's baked in the cake. Between 6 and 18 months after you get a big change in the money supply, you start getting changes in real economic activity. Well, money supply M2 peaked a year ago in July of 2022, and it's been headed south big time ever since then. So we already are in this 6 to 18 month zone where we start seeing weakness showing up in the economy, and that's why I think by the first quarter of next year we'll see a recession. We'll be in a recession, and it is baked in the cake because money is what drives the economy. It's what drives economic activity. It's what drives asset prices, and it's what drives inflation. But it does all of this. The changes in the money supply come way before changes in asset prices, changes in economic activity, and changes in inflation. Those things all lag behind changes in the money supply. So the recession lags behind all this contraction that we've had in the money supply. But that's not what Powell's looking at, David. He's looking at the numbers today, what the number says today. And he's just not looking at the right thing. He's looking at lagging indicators.
There may be social costs associated with restoring price stability. The social costs of failing to restore price stability will be higher.
Well, if you can restore price stability by doing the right thing, which he's going to impose a lot of cost to impose price stability because he's squeezing the money supply way too hard. He's not looking at the money supply. If he wanted to get close to the inflation target of 2%, he'd have to be growing the money supply at about 5 or 6% per annum. He's contracting the money supply now and contracting it by 4% per annum. So he's just overdoing it. He will impose a lot of cost. Inflation's coming down. Inflation's that was last year's story. Inflation. We're past that because we have had this huge monetary squeeze. But he doesn't realize that we're past it. He's still squeezing. The Volcker era was interesting because Volcker had my point of view on what should be done. He was watching the money supply, and he thought that he was gradually squeezing the money supply to the point that would be appropriate to get inflation. The problem was that the money supply measures at the time were misleading. He didn't think he was tightening as much as he actually was. He actually was tightening much more than he thought he was. So it's a very technical discussion between simple sum indices for measuring the money supply versus what they call divisia measures, which take into account kind of the weights that are put on the components of the money supply. And it is quite technical, but it turns out the divisia numbers would have been appropriate to be looking at the time for money supply. He was not looking at those, and the reason he wasn't is that the research department at the Fed wasn't giving him the numbers. They had them in a safe, literally. They weren't releasing the thing. So Volcker thought he was going through a kind of a moderate squeeze that would get things settled down in a hurry. In fact, he was over squeezing, but he didn't know it. And the reason he didn't know it, he wasn't looking at the right money supply number. There were two recessions during the squeeze that was put on, one in 1981 and one in 1983. And those could have been avoided if the over squeeze hadn't occurred. If the over squeeze hadn't occurred, I don't think we would have seen maybe much milder recessions. But the squeeze was too much, and there were costs, and there are costs even now, because we're talking about, well, what would the cost be because we're going to have a recession? Well, that's obvious, but there was a cost with inflation, and we're talking about Bidenomics today. How great that's been for everybody. Well, real wages have actually declined because inflation went up faster than the nominal wages went up, and so real wages adjusted for inflation went down. Real average wages actually went down because of inflation. So the Fed makes all kinds of mistakes. Let's get down to where the rubber meets the road here. What has been going on in the last few years? We've had a lot of inflation. Okay, what does that do? That eats into your nominal wage that you receive, and once that wage is adjusted for inflation, your real wage goes down because of inflation. So that was phase one. Now phase two is the following. We have inflation coming down from its peak of 9.1% headline in the US to 4%, and it's going lower because of the monetary squeeze. Now, that will eventually end up in a recession in early 2024. And that will mean that the employment picture and the labor market